We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi Liz from the other side of the table. How are you this morning?
I'm good. I am very good at putting my finger on the wrong place in the keyboard, so I looked for a second like I was going to try and mine with a diamond sword.
Outstanding.
Hopefully I make more sense.
We shall see. Okay, so today, Liz, we're talking about the Fleming and Shea's paper, Quality Space Computations for Consciousness, that was published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences towards the end of last year. So this will be the first in our series on new papers in consciousness studies, obviously using new a bit loosely there, given how long it takes us to put these things together. It is less than a year old, though. Yeah. We'll, of course, put a link to the paper in the show notes, and if you go there to the journal page, you'll see some commentaries from a song, as well as Delager. I'm sorry for my pronunciation of that name. That's Delager et al. So I chose this paper for us to discuss, and I did for basically two reasons. The first being one, quality spaces. Hooray.
Yay!
Yeah. People are coming back to them, which is going to be a common reason for papers that I choose. At least the first couple have been like that. And the second reason, this is a TICS article published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, which, in case anyone isn't familiar with that particular journal, tends to publish these short, punchy little review or theory pieces, so it's kind of an easy place for us to start. Before we jump into Fleming and Shea's piece, we should talk a bit about what quality spaces are. Or should we just link to Austin Clarke's book and get everyone to pause the video here and go and read the books and then come back to us?
That would be nice and easy, but no.
Yep. Alright, so pause your video now. Alright. Go read Sensory Qualities and the Theory of Sentience and then come back. Alright, everyone done that? What are quality spaces? So quality spaces are, first, they're a way of describing experiences for the purposes of studying them scientifically. They're to date the most detailed way we have of describing experiences. In particular, that aspect of experience or consciousness that is often considered the most difficult to describe and explain. The phenomenal character of experience, sometimes called phenomenal qualities. So this is what's sometimes called the what it is like of experience. So the blueness of blue, the awfulness of pain, etc., etc. Alright, did I get that right, Liz? This is your zone.
Sorry, I was being distracted by Minecraft. Say that again. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the thing that it seems that somebody who was born blind wouldn't know about colours.
Yes.
Is I think a great way to see it.
See it, yeah.
Or somebody born deaf wouldn't know about sound.
Sound, yeah. Alright, so the core idea of quality spaces is they map, and this is meant quite literally, as a map that you can draw, experiences and the relations between experiences in higher dimensional spaces. These maps then provide the data that needs to be explained by a theory of consciousness. So rather than trying to explain something vague like the blueness of blue, a theory of consciousness should explain the particular structure of color space. So what do these look like? Well, you probably produced approximations of one of them when you were a kid. The driving idea behind most of the experimental techniques that we use to get them is that quality spaces are produced by ordering experiences in lists based on their similarity. So like those textures that you have that click together, you know what I'm on about?
Yep.
Liz, yep, you've had some of them.
Or even just pencils in a box.
Pencils in a box. I like the clicky ones. They're satisfying. So, you know how it's like natural to click them together in a particular way? So you grab the purple one first because that's the best color and go purple, cool. Or purple's a bit reddish, so you put red on next to it and then red is a bit orangish, so you attach the orange one to the red. Yellow fits then in after the orange, and then you get that weird, gross yellow-green one, a few greens, the aqua one, the blues, and then we come back around and we're back at purple. Alright, so this creates a circle of hues that approximate what you get in the experiments. But you get a couple left over. It's this one. Which one is it?
Glenn wants me to say brown, but I think most kids would put brown in around red and yellow.
Around red and yellow? Alright. What about this other one that's grey? Yeah.
Grey. Yeah, grey was always the annoying one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I probably ended up putting it near yellow, but not really liking that.
Not liking that, yep. Alright. So, browns in experiments end up being sort of like dark oranges and yellows, sort of like pinks are light reds. So you need to add in an extra dimension there of lightness and darkness. So you get in the circle, you get just the hue. So this is what we would normally call color: red, green, blue, yellow, etc. Form a circle-ish shape. And then we want to add in another dimension for lightness and darkness. What about if we, so trying to get our head around where grey goes, what if we go to Liz's idea, instead of using the textures, we're using the pencils, and we add in a set of pastel pencils? Where do they go compared to the really...
You sort of want to... I know the answer Glenn wants me to say. So the pastels, right, so... Yeah, I would, as a kid, I probably wouldn't have known what to do. I would have been annoyed. Because it's like, I can't put really light blue next to dark blue and then have it go into green.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that the solution is to have another dimension where you go from light blue to pastel blue, going, say, up and down as opposed to around.
Yeah, so the pastels, as well as being sort of lighter, I think are less saturated. So
less colourful.
Yeah, so there's less of that sort of bright colouriness of it. I know bright's a misleading word in a technical sense. Yeah, so they're what I think is helpful for understanding where the grey and black ones go. So if you can make one circle with the textures and then put another circle inside with the sort of less, we call this less saturated colours with the pastels, and then all the way inside towards the centre where greys will be. That's how it turns out in experiments. As Liz showed, it sort of gets less intuitive the more detail you get into this. And you end up with some really interesting insights that about experience that you just can't tell from just having experience. So I think that we get a bulge in the purples, don't we? So we can distinguish more purples than oranges. Am I getting that the right way around, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, it's around the blue-red rather than...
Yeah. Rather than the red-yellow, yeah. How we produce, the more detailed versions of this experimentally is we get people to make a bunch of similarity judgments, sort of similar in spirit to what we were just talking about, but more detailed and more precise, of course. And then we use a variety of statistical techniques, generally from the family that we call multidimensional scaling. And from that, we produce a quality space like the color spindle that we've been talking about. That would be the most famous one. But you can do this for all sorts of things. It's been popular in face and emotion perception. For example, I've done it in the context of hands and the rubber hand illusion. Clark, in his book, which you just all went and read, so I probably don't need to tell you all this, does it for a variety of different sensory experiences, taste, smell, etc., etc.
So here's another example. I'm part of a barbershop chorus, And it turns out that different people have different vocal tones, I guess. And so I have a relatively rich voice, as does Glenn. And it turns out that it's easier to sing when you're singing next to somebody with a voice of the same sort of timbre as yours. So we organise our chorus according to our vocal types. Because we're in the Onkaparinga region and we're Onkaparinga Harmony Chorus, we describe our voices in terms of wines, because it's a wine region.
Yeah.
So,
it's really helpful for the alcoholics at the table.
Rich voices like mine we talk about as being Shirazes, and then the really light toned voices we talk about as being sparkling, like a sparkling wine. And so every couple of weeks when we have changes to the chorus, we all go round and sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat and organise ourselves in a line going from sparkling to Shiraz. Again, organising just vocal tones in terms of similarity.
Similarity, yeah. Excellent. That's so cool. So, and that example there, we're not looking at a radial dimension like we do with colours, where they sort of circle back onto each other, but more a straight line sort of dimension where things just get more different the further along you go in
and
it. Yeah.
It's really fun. I'm quite down the Shiraz end, and when I was new to the chorus, they got me to sing next to somebody who was really sparkling, and it was just quite literally more difficult to get the sound
right. Yeah.
It just felt like I was fighting against something.
Yeah. Wow.
It was quite visceral too.
Yeah.
I was accidentally quite rude.
At least. Emotions are dramatic, yes. All right, so once we discover these sorts of quality spaces, then we have a very detailed description, even a mathematizable description of experiences in terms of their relative similarity. So the idea is that a point or a vector in the space corresponds to a particular experience, and that distances between those points or vectors correspond to the similarity between them. All right, so any ultimately successful theory of consciousness must explain quality spaces. Why is it that purples are more like red than yellow? And we can even, from doing this, discover things that need to be explained that we didn't know from just having experiences. So these are things like what we were talking about before, like why can we distinguish more purples than oranges? Alright, so we got the gist of what quality spaces are. We're alright to get on with the paper that we're here to talk about?
Yes.
Excellent. Let's get into the interesting stuff. So Fleming and Shea are pushing for a kind of identity explanation of quality spaces. So,
woohoo!
Yeah, so
Adelaide identity.
Yep. Of course, us coming from the University of Place and Smart and so on, we're steeped in a strong tradition of identity theory. So a quality space like the colour spindle has the structure it has because it is identified with a neural activation space which has the same structure. So this is the underlying idea of what an identity explanation of a quality space would look like. So here's a quote from Fleming and Shea. So a core claim is that subjective similarity can be accounted for in terms of neural similarity. That is, in terms of the distance in neural activation space between patterns of neural activity responsible for realizing experiences. End quote. So this has been a kind of working hypothesis for many of the quality space identity theorists, at least since the early 90s, right? But to just make sense of that claim, we need to know what a neural activation space is. The idea of a neural activation space, this has been influential amongst connectionists and dynamic systems theorists. So it's a way of describing the activity of a neural network, or we hope, ultimately, eventually, maybe, Liz will throw...
The brain?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Maybe the brain, eventually, if we can measure the things that we want to measure about the brain. So it's a description of neural activity that is helpful in understanding how the network is computing. And this description also makes use of high dimensional theoretical spaces. So make each neuron a dimension in that space. So in the quality spaces, we had dimensions like hue, which was a radial dimension. We had the richness of the voice that Liz was talking about. We had how saturated a color is, which is the sort of grey to colourfulness of a thing. Here, dimensions are a bit different. We're assigning a dimension to each neuron, whether this is a unit in an artificial network or hypothetically a real neuron in the brain. And then we're going to assign the activation of the neuron. So usually this is the rate of fire of the neuron. We're going to assign that a numerical value. Each neuron then has a value at any particular time. It's through a period of time. It's firing at a particular rate. And so the pattern of activity across all of those neurons is a vector in this neural activation space. Did that make sense, or was I a bit all over the shop there?
I'm wondering if I can demonstrate similarities in patterns of activity using pumpkins that are lit or not.
Cool. Do it.
Yeah, I will. Just have to harvest some pumpkins.
Harvest some pumpkins, yep. The possibility of describing neural activity like this invites a working hypothesis with quality spaces, right? So if a neural activation space has the same structure, so the same relations of similarity as a quality space, maybe it just is the quality space. Or maybe the quality space is a lower dimensional representation of the unbelievably high dimensional neural activation space. So when you're talking neurons in a human brain, you're talking billions of neurons, right? And so billions of dimensions. So there's a few empirical proposals around as to exactly how it would work. But this, I think, is a fairly sort of familiar idea to people who work with quality spaces. But Fleming and Shea make a more provocative claim here, I think, because they say, quote, empirical results suggest that neural similarity reflects subjective similarity, end quote. So we can just go and look at those results and then settle on this form of identity theory and all go home? Liz, you're going to tell me what's wrong with that.
Say the quote again, please.
The quote is just empirical results suggest that neural similarity reflects subjective similarity.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That the difficulty is measuring neural similarity.
Yeah.
Because if we're talking about activation of individual neurons, really the best technology we have to get that really fine-grained information is to stick an electrode in an organism's brain. And we don't usually do that for humans unless it's, say, to cut out cancer. We want to work out where we're going to preserve regions. So other measures are more indirect and therefore potentially not actually showing us what we need to show. So if you look at the simple pumpkin wall I've just done three rows of pumpkins, and let's say each row represents one possible level of activity. So if we're going to organise them according to similarity, the one where all of the pumpkins are dark is most different from the one where the next one down where all of the pumpkins are lit. If we wanted to go for the one that's most similar to the one where all of the pumpkins are lit, we'd say it's the ones where two of the three are lit. So this one is most similar to this one. To do that, we need to know whether each individual pumpkin is a light or not. The only way to do that in the brain is to stick an electrode in. Most of the other techniques are equivalent to averaging how bright that area is, as opposed to measuring each pumpkin.
Cool. And so there's another problem as well on top of that, which is neural specialization, right? So we know from selective lesioning studies and so on that different parts of the brain are more important for certain tasks, including certain conscious perceptual tasks than others. So even if we can get fine-grained enough, we need to know which network, which part of the brain is the really important part. So I sort of introduced this saying the brain is billions of neurons, and suggesting that you can have a neural activation space for the whole brain, which of course you can't do. But you don't know which part of that space is the relevant part for, say, color perception or body perception or what have you. It won't be all of it, we think, because you can lose those particular perceptual abilities without losing others by losing particular parts of the brain. There's a grain issue as well in terms of selecting which neural activation space is the relevant one for a particular experience.
But as Glenn suggested before, lesion studies and other things like that have given us pretty good ideas about that.
About roughly where they are,
Yeah.
but you're still looking at millions of neurons.
Right.
In there. I guess then what do we measure in brain activation studies? So we can measure changes to the electric or magnetic field near the skull. It's hard to get a lot of fine-grained spatial resolution through these studies, and what you see is the effects on those fields for the firing of all of the neurons near the scalp, which, in humans is the cortex and probably the most interesting part for consciousness, we think. But you're still averaging over a very large number of neurons and brain regions. We can get better spatial resolution with fMRI, but there what we're looking at is changes in blood flow to, again, relatively large groups of cells, of neurons, which shows which groups have become more active in particular tasks. So basically, unless we're okay with torturing a lot of monkeys, which is where the single cell recordings come from, what tends to be available for making these similarity claims is pattern analysis of the images in fMRI. So identifying which neurons have become more or less active in particular tasks by how the blood flow to them changes. And look, to be fair, I should say that Fleming and Shea conclude that there are associations between similarity spaces of MEG and EEG images as well. So that's the changes to magnetic and electric fields near the skull. None of those studies involve torturing monkeys in the way that single cell recording does. So the studies they're interested in, Fleming and Shea, they're focusing on what's called representational similarity analysis. So from what they're saying, fMRI images associated with different stimuli are compared in pairs to get a similarity space. And so Fleming and Shea claim we can look for correlations between the similarity space for patterns of activity as measured by fMRI and quality spaces. Now, because this is a TICS paper, we don't get detailed reviews of those studies as such. Instead, Fleming and Shea just tell us the conclusions they've taken from those studies.
So we have to take them at their word.
Yeah.
And I'm not implying that they are lying, but interpreting data is tricky.
They say, quote, different subregions within the ventral visual cortex were shown to correlate with different aspects of subjective similarity, end quote. Where the subjective similarity subjects reported on was things like shape and colour. Alright, so that sounds promising, but here is, my nemesis when it comes to scientific and philosophical papers. I get things are done quickly in this paper. It is a TICS article, it is short, it is designed to be, a quick pickup, quick read sort of paper. And I'm definitely not picking on Fleming and Shea in particular here, because I think this happens in longer form review and theory papers as well. I just wish it were okay in these articles to go into greater detail about the experiments that are used to argue for the support of a theory. Yeah, so I've lost the battle of this, I'm sure, and I know people find my way of writing where I go over example experiments in a really long-winded and boring way. You know, I know people find that boring, and I've no count of the number of times that reviewers have said things like, you know, readers can go to the original experimental reports if they want the detail of the experiment, and that's not false as such. But the detail in the experiments is what makes the outcomes convincing or not as evidence.
The whole point of using empirical data to speak to philosophical questions is that the empirical data is a premise in an argument. Now, empirical data is not produced in a vacuum. It is part of a larger experimental system and a part of a larger scientific paradigm. And so to think that you can present a piece of evidence and have that be convincing, to think that you can present a piece of evidence in a vacuum and have that be sufficiently convincing to be an argument about, you know, bigger theoretical issues is just a deep misunderstanding of the nature of data collection.
Yeah.
I think that's what it comes down to. And so then the question is, can you trust that the reader will have the capability, let alone the time, to go off and read the individual research? I don't think so. So I think part of the job that people who bridge the gap between science and philosophy have is to make the data accessible to people who do not have the training themselves to go out and read a vast literature. It's also to make it accessible to those who do have the training but don't have the time. And so the question is ultimately whether summarising within a paper is appropriate or not. Even if it's not appropriate because the venue is TICS, I think it is appropriate in other venues to do so. Otherwise, it's just like an unjustified premise
yeah.
in an argument.
Yeah, exactly. Hard agree. So, yeah, this is another way to put the same point, right? So if you've made the effort to pick up something that I've written, I want as much of the argument for my conclusions to be in that thing which you've taken the time to pick up and read. If it's then saying, well, you know, here's an interesting premise, but to see if it's in any way justified, you need to go and pick up, you know, these 600 other experimental papers and read, I just think is wasting people's time. Why should they believe me if I can't explain why the experiment justifies the premise in the argument?
Now, for those newbies out there, it's possibly no accident that we think this and we have not found careers in academia, because doing this work, reading the entire literature rather than one experiment, is incredibly time-consuming and not conducive to the rapid rate of publication required to obtain a permanent academic position.
So this claim from Fleming and Shea, which is really interesting and potentially supports the identity claim, and something else which I'm sure Liz will want to talk about and we'll get to a lot, I'm sure, which is the possibility of the existence of phenomenal qualities of which we are unaware. Right, so here's the quote, studies of the neural encoding of faces in macaque inferotemporal cortex, or IT cortex, highlighted how individual faces are represented by a linear combination of neural activations within a 50-dimensional face space. Notably, using binocular rivalry, both the consciously perceived and suppressed faces could be decoded from the inferotemporal neuronal activations, but they occurred in distinct spaces. Now, sure, I can go and read the two original studies by Chang and Chow and Hesse and Chow. But in an alternative universe, I can also just read about them here in Fleming and Shea's study to see how much I buy into their conclusion. Because that's all they say about it.
So one reading of that quote is that I have a conscious face perception network and an unconscious face perception network. Weird and wasteful. Mm. Another reading of that quote is that I have networks that represent slight differences between the one face. And so the face that I'm aware of is represented in... I have one network that represents Glenn's face and all of the variations in it, and another network that represents my face and all of the variations in it. And the difference is which one I'm aware of. I've got no idea, and both of those sound a little bit weird.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think it would be helpful for us to try and sort of make sense of this claim.
Yeah.
So we should start with what binocular rivalry is. Binocular rivalry results are really interesting and I think quite counterintuitive. So if in a study you get people to wear goggles such that one image is presented to their left eye, say a house, and a different image is presented to the right eye, say a face, what do you think intuitively people would see based on that?
Face superimposed on a house
face
or vice versa.
Yeah, that seems entirely intuitive to me, but it's completely false. That's not what people see at all. They see alternating images, first a house and then a face, or the other way around, and it flips back and forth between them.
What you see is what you would see if you closed one eye and then the other.
Yeah.
Rather than merging the two.
Merging of the images, yeah.
Weird.
But there's still evidence that what the subject doesn't see, so the eye that the subject isn't saying, yeah, I see, they're saying I see a house at the moment, the other eye is getting a face, that information about the face is still being processed unconsciously. What I think they're saying is happening in these studies is that monkeys are shown two different faces at a time, one to each eye, in this sort of binocular rivalry setup, and that using imaging of the IT cortex in the monkeys, they're able to decode from that activity which face the monkey sees and which one is being processed only unconsciously. And that these occur in two separate spaces. So there's one part of the fMRI image that they can look at that and tell from that which face the monkey is currently seeing. And there's another part of the fMRI image that they can look at and tell which face is currently being processed unconsciously by the monkey.
That strikes me as weird and wasteful.
Yeah, but I think
like in a way that makes me worried about the validity of the data.
Yeah. I don't know, I think it fits nicely with like Dennett's multiple drafts idea that there's representations of both faces that are being presented.
So what
and one of them is the winning draft, and that's the one that ends up in the...
But why... But that means that you need to have as many spaces for faces as you have potential drafts. Are we saying that the activity in these areas resembles the monkey's classification of the similarity of faces? Because just being able to predict, this just seems to me, without seeing all of the detail, this seems to me the same thing as they do with people in persistent vegetative states, where they tell them to imagine playing tennis.
The hidden premise here, which I haven't said, and which doesn't appear, I not from my memory, and, this might just be me, in Fleming and Shea's paper, is that decoding as a method depends on similarity. So it produces a similarity space of the images.
So I have a similarity space of faces that I have constructed based on human judgments.
No, I think these are based on monkey judgments. Because
Okay.
I think they're monkey faces. But again, like, even that detail doesn't appear in the Fleming and Shea paper. Are they looking at human faces or monkey faces? I assume it's monkey, but I don't know.
I know some monkey face perception data is on human faces, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a face space that is generated based on the judgments, and then I can take MRI, is it, images?
Yep.
That are created when looking at different faces and organise them into a space with a similar structure.
Yep.
And then if I present it with a new face, if I look at the MRI image for a new face, I can predict what face the monkey is looking at without knowing. I'm guessing that's what they mean by decoding.
Yeah, I'm not sure that has to be a new face even. But look, I don't want to get hung up on these details, because really I just wanted to talk about this example because this study is going to be a premise in their following argument. So what we're going to spend some time on next. As you can see from what they say about it, we don't really know what's happening in that study. And I certainly don't, and maybe my explanation of it was just a bit shit, but honestly, I just quoted what they said about it. So you've heard
everything they said about it. Yeah.
So you've heard everything that's in this paper about that study that I know. I don't know if the rest of their paper is justified, because I don't know that their reading of that article is helpful.
And I also worry about... So, yeah, have they understood it correctly? Let's trust them that they have, but honestly, you're meant to be sceptical about people's premises and not give them to them for free.
Yeah.
So it's bad argumentative hygiene.
Yeah.
But also one experiment.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a few others that they talk about. They don't provide more detail in it. We'd have the same, not exactly the same questions because they're different experiments, but the same kind of questions as about, are we sure that this is measuring exactly what it needs to measure in order to feature in Fleming and Shea's argument, right? And again, look, this isn't a criticism of Fleming and Shea. They've deliberately chosen to write a short form article in TIGS. But this sort of thing comes up a lot, even in papers where you've got 10,000 words to make your argument. And if you've got 10,000 words to make your argument, you should be able to explain a key experiment, even if you don't do it for every single one, because, obviously you want there to be converging evidence and replication and so on, and so you don't have to talk about every single replication in the same detail. But the key experiments that are forming the evidence for your key premises should be explained more.
Yes.
And this just isn't the convention at the moment.
And for the simple reason that science is complicated. People make a whole career out of doing one type of experiment.
Yeah.
And to think that you can summarize the data from one experiment without putting it in context and draw strong conclusions from it, I think is just deeply problematic.
Yeah.
It makes it, it doesn't move it sufficiently from an assumption to a justified premise.
Yeah. All right, so that's our high horse for this paper. Expect us to come back to this a lot. Let's turn to Fleming and Shea's argument and what they're trying to use this evidence for. They say, and they're trying to distinguish between two versions of the quality space hypothesis. The first is what they call the instantiated relations view, which they describe as modest. Now, I'm not super clear on the difference between these accounts. Liz, we have talked before trying to get our heads around the difference here, and we had a hard time. But I think what's going to be most helpful is if I just quote their statement of what these two views are. So this is the first one, the instantiated relations, the modest proposal. So, quote, "A modest claim is that the properties that characterize conscious experience fall into families, such that properties within the same family, for example color experiences, bear relations of phenomenal similarity and difference to one another. An analogy is the way in which the level of mercury in a thermometer represents temperature. Different levels represent different temperatures, forming an organized representational system. The relational structure of temperature readings is latent in a given temperature reading, but is not represented by a single reading. Under this view, the subject only experiences relations between aspects of their overall experiential state, that is, between aspects they actually instantiate."
So I don't experience the relationship between two different volumes because I can't instantiate them both at the same time.
Yeah.
If I'm only ever looking at isolated colours, I don't ever experience the relationship between two colours.
Yeah, so if you look at what's on Minecraft at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what colours do you see there?
Greys, pink, orange.
Yeah, so
white.
You're experiencing the relations between those colours, but not between ones that aren't there.
Whoa. No, but okay, so when we're in a line singing, we organise ourselves by singing one at a time. So we can't... How in the world could we ever order ourselves if we can't experience the relationship between two voices singing in sequence? What?
Yeah.
Is that really what they mean?
I guess there's a question here about what overall experiential state means and how
temporally
extended that is. So how important is working memory to that overall experiential state? Let's contrast this to the stronger claim, which is they call the whole structured view. And I think this is the one that they favour. So a more arresting claim, this is a quote, is that the phenomenal character of a single point in quality space taken on its own is affected by the overall structure of quality space. For instance, Lau argues that the phenomenal character of experience, i.e. what it is like to have an experience, comprises experiencing how that experience is similar to other experiences. Under this view, if the range over which experiences could occur across that space were different, even in a distant part of space, the subject's experience would be different. An analogy is the way in which the little blue dot on a smartphone map represents not only where the user is at that moment, but also the user's spatial relations to all other points shown on the screen. If the map were larger or smaller, the content represented would be different. An upshot is that a creature that could only ever experience a single flash of light would not experience it as having a particular colour, end quote.
But we experience isolated patches viewed over an extended period of time as having a colour. Is that in virtue of the fact that at different points in time we can experience different colours?
If the whole structure view was right, yes, it would depend on that.
Yeah, I'm really, really worried about how to interpret the temporal nature of instantiation.
Yeah.
Because maybe they are not distinguishing between what's required to have the space. So how do you take the blank slate, so to speak, and train it up to be capable of having it?
Yeah.
And then what is constitutive of the experiences? Because if you change one of the volumes, you're going to change all the other volumes. There's a bit in the middle of the quote where they say something along those lines for the view they endorse.
Is it this part? If the range over which experiences could occur across that space were different, even in a different part of that space, the subject's experience would be different. If you changed how greens are represented, so if you, say, created a narrower range of greens that we could distinguish and change that side of the spindle, that would also change how we experience red and blue and so on and things in other parts of the space, because the whole space has changed.
Would a better analogy be not zooming in and out on a map, but rather warping a map? Like as in bending it or...
Yeah, so warping a map would be like, narrowing the range of greens that we can distinguish.
So you've got 3 points. A is 1 metre away from B and A is 2 metres away from C. If you zoom out so that A is now 2 metres away from B, then won't A be 4 metres away from C? You double it, and so the structure of the relations is the same.
Yep.
And so I think that that's not the same as your green example, where you're actually changing the space. So the difference between zooming in and out and the thermometer is entirely whether all the other relations are instantiated or not. Well, wouldn't the equivalent with the thermometer be changing the structure of the tube? So like making the tube wider? Are they trying to get at sometimes you instantiate all of the relations and other times you don't, in which case we can do both in a trained up visual system?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just that, like, if you have a thermometer and it's so and so high, that doesn't represent temperature on its own because it doesn't contain any of the relationships in just that height. And that's why you need to put a symbolic scale on the side of it that informs us about how it changes. I think the map thing, the map example here is if, like, you got the dot that's your location, and at a certain scale represents your location relative to objects on a particular block where you are. So if we have it just on our block, it shows where we are relative to a bunch of houses, and it says nothing about where you are relative to the power station or the shops that are a couple of blocks away. But if you zoom out,
well, so if you change the but that's adding more information.
Adding more information in, yeah.
No. If you folded the map in half of our block, you'd suddenly think we're closer to a house 10 houses away. I feel like the difference between the examples is underspecified. There are a lot of differences between the examples. I feel like zooming out doesn't necessarily help because the relations remain the same. Yeah. The size of the scale, the
scale changes, but the relations remain the same.
So if it's all there and you're just zooming in and out, if it's not all there and you're adding to it, then you're just fundamentally changing it. And I think the interesting possibility is more around warping or folding the map, because that's what their example seems to be trying to get at.
Yeah, and that's why I said, what if we could distinguish less greens than we can?
Or fold the map in half.
Or twist it or some way, yeah. All right, so that's our second time trying to get our head around exactly what the difference is. And we've picked up different
things each time.
Yeah, but based on these quotes, which are from my reading of the paper, and again, this might just be me, but I thought that these two quotes, these two paragraphs, were the statements of what the positions were, and we're having a hard time telling what the difference is. So we're a bit confused at this point, which is a shame because the bulk of the argument of the paper, and we're finally getting to that. We're halfway through my notes. We're finally getting to the argument that they're providing, which is they're going to focus on the instantiated relations view and the whole structure view. So versions of the quality space hypothesis, and see how they fare when understood alongside some auxiliary explanatory hypotheses. So basically, they're going to try and fit these into other existent theories of consciousness, of phenomenal qualities, and see how they fare with those. So the first of these is what they call a localist theory of consciousness. This would be any theory that would say the relevant neuroactivation space for explaining a particular quality space will be one that is local to a particular sensory system. So in the above example would be local to subregions within the ventral visual cortex. That's the part of the brain they were talking about. No other neural activity of the kind that would be needed for global broadcast or higher order thought, those are two theories of awareness, is needed. So you're just talking about this subregion of the ventral visual cortex.
So our colour space is identical to a neural activation space, and that's all you need to do to explain colours.
Yeah, you just find the part of the brain in the sensory processing stream whose activation space corresponds to the quality space.
You can have brain damage and then lose the ability to see colours.
Yep.
Let's say we home in on that area of the brain that causes a chromatopsia or something.
Yep.
Yay, I read words and see them as shapes, not sounds. Which is really weird when you're dealing with characters in a novel.
Yeah.
Oh, is that their name?
Especially fantasy novels with weird names.
But so the idea is, okay, this is the bit of brain where if you damage it, people will no longer see colours. Let's home in on that area, map the structure of the activity in it, and that's going to have the same structure as the colours that the person had before they were brain damaged or whatever.
So that would be the hypothesis. All right, so if we're going to understand the instantiated relations version of the quality space hypothesis with this sort of localist assumption, it's easiest just to quote what they say. This view explains why local patterns of activation, which localist theories claim are the basis of specific contents becoming conscious, have qualitative character. First, they exist in a similarity space, implemented in a neural activation space, the dimensions of which, as with size or colour, give the experience its particular character. Just as a particular level of mercury in a thermometer falls in a similarity space with other levels of mercury. Second, relations between actually instantiated experiences, points in space, are themselves experienced. End quote.
So instantiated relations is the thermometer one.
Yes.
So here's the complicating factor. If you feel your visual field, so you take so the old school way to do this would be to take like a yellow ping pong ball and cut it in half and put it over your eye and close the other eye. If you do that, you don't see it as yellow. You see it as some achromatic surface. So the idea that you can talk about colour experiences in isolation is more complicated in virtue of that.
Yeah. I think they'll like that because they'll want to go for the
other view.
The more arresting view. The whole structure view. Come back to the use of the mercury thermometer in that last quote as well, as I think that opens up why some people might think we need to go for a global workspace or some other use theory of consciousness. They might think that similarity explains mental representation, but not consciousness. So that's going to be a whole thing. We'll get to that in a bit. Before that, Fleming and Shea spend some time on their stronger claim, the whole structure view. This view invites us to consider not only patterns of activity in the firing of neurons, which we have some indirect, speculative evidence about. We just had a big headache about that a couple of minutes ago. But also the computational processes that cause particular patterns of activity to be elicited. This, they point out, and quite rightly, I think, depends on inputs from prior neural activity bottoming out at sensory receptors and what's sometimes called top-down connections from elsewhere in the brain. If we're thinking of, in particular, local pattern of activity as a point in activation space and quality space, and as a particular representing vehicle, it is computed from sensory input, yes, but also knowledge embodied in the wider connections of the brain. The basic point here, I think, is simple enough. The whole structure of the quality space is hypothesized to be represented, superpositionally, dispositionally, throw all the connections buzzwords in there, in the connections which are causally responsible for a particular pattern of activation to be elicited.
So connections here are the scope of connection here is incredibly ambiguous. The representations which are inexplicit in some form, which are the connections within the network that enable it to instantiate those patterns of activation. And then if you're talking about a whole brain which has regions which are dedicated to different things, you're going to have connections between regions. So are they talking about the connections within the region that enable it to have a pattern of activation, or are they talking about connections between different regions?
Yeah, so in their terms, how local is the localist assumption?
And so then the question is, how global do you have to be?
Yeah.
And I am uncomfortable because you really need to distinguish between the questions about the structure of the phenomenal space and then its representational content, and I think they are quite different, and how our phenomenal colour space is deployed to represent things about the world is much messier than the structure of our phenomenal colour space.
They think that there is some evidence for the whole structure view with this localist assumption. Again, I find their summary of it a bit too quick, so I just want to quote what they say. Again, this is a quote. Some intriguing psychophysical evidence for this view was obtained by Song et al. Using a Hebbian training protocol to strengthen lateral connections between 2 points of visual space. The perceived distance between untrained locations was also altered. These findings suggest that a local change in the strength of lateral connections is sufficient to alter the experience of visual spatial relations. End quote.
So this is like folding your map.
Yeah.
If you fold the map in one place, it's still going to change relations across the fold.
Yeah,
Two things that are far away from the fold,
mm-hmm.
their relationship is going to be different.
If you warp one part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And their place, if the line between them goes between where it's warped.
Yeah. After this, they're going to spend some time looking at how other theories of consciousness manage their distinction between the different versions of the quality space view. This isn't argued for much, but I think we can see why they do this. All the associating quality spaces with structural representations like mercury thermometers might make someone think that quality spaces describe how we represent things, but not how we are conscious of them. The sort of alternative that we'd favour, Liz, I think, is a kind of identity theory that explains phenomenal qualities in the way that we've been talking about as some sort of identity between quality space and neuroactivation space, but that a use theory like Dennett's or either of the two, which they're going to consider here, so this is Rosenthal's higher order thought and the global workspace theory, any of those sorts of view is needed to
explain awareness.
Explain awareness, yeah.
So there's phenomenal qualities, and they're explained by identity, and awareness is explained by use. Right?
Yeah.
Like
But
Dennett's version.
yeah, so this idea doesn't seem to really be on the table
What?
in this paper, which I think is weird because there's definitely a reading of Rosenthal's view, which they otherwise spent quite a bit of time on, which is pretty close to what we think, that there are separate explanations for phenomenal qualities and for awareness. So this is how they describe Rosenthal's view. All right, quote. According to Rosenthal's higher order theory, qualitative character is given by higher order thoughts that represent mental qualities of locations in a quality space. End quote. For Fleming and Shea, the important thing about this view is, quote, the subject can appreciate the relation between two mental qualities that occur concurrently and thus discriminate between them, but not between experiences that occur at different times. Instantiated relations contribute to phenomenal character, but the whole structure of quality space does not. End quote. So they're saying that only an instantiated relations version of a quality space view is possible for Rosenthal.
Even if a neural network can only have one pattern of activation at one point in time, because its ability to have a pattern of activation is grounded in connection weights, then you can change the connection weights.
Yeah, but I think the point there is that what's in the connection weights isn't represented by the higher order thought that makes it conscious on their reading of Rosenthal.
That makes it conscious and phenomenal?
Yes, that's how they're reading Rosenthal. And that's the bit that I'm really stuck on, because that's not how I read Rosenthal at all. Because I thought...
And then what explanatory work does the identity do?
Yeah.
Because if the higher order thought is necessary for phenomenal experiences, then you have to be Dennett.
Yeah.
And whatever's going on below, that doesn't explain the phenomenal.
That only explains representation.
And this is why I don't think Rosenthal holds this view, because then if you want to use similarity, then you have to have that similarity space reconstructed in the relations between the higher order thoughts, and you end up with it goes on forever.
I thought Rosenthal was saying that there are sensory qualities of the kind described by quality spaces, and that these are the basis of how we can make judgments about experiences, sort them into types, that's his terminology, that sort of thing. Yet consciousness is something more than this, because there are loads of reasons to think there are unconscious representations of colour or shape, that sort of stuff, like you get in mass priming studies. So for those that aren't familiar with a mass priming study, the general idea here is that there is behavioural evidence of the effect of, say, the shape of a stimulus that's presented really quickly and then replaced by something else that's a different shape. Do that so far, subjects say they didn't see the first shape, but that first shape still impacts their behaviour in some way. And that's the difference that he posits the higher order thought to explain, to differentiate between the second stimulus, which the subject says they saw, and the first, which they say they didn't, but which still affects their behaviour. The higher order thought isn't about explaining the sensory qualities. Those things are prior to the higher order thought. Am I way off in my reading of Rosenthal?
I haven't read Rosenthal anywhere near as recently as you, and I always felt like he was ambiguous between the two. And when we do our 101 series, we'll talk about how the difference between the sort of view we hold and the sort of view Dennett holds comes down to whether it makes sense to talk about real seemings when there's no one it's seeming to.
Yeah.
And we are on the conceptual change end of that, so yes, it does. And Dennett's on the elimination side of that, and so he says it doesn't make sense, we need to stop talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think without really explicitly discussing whether to bite that bullet or not, it's really, really hard to classify most views.
Yeah, because
so even,
I think maybe we'll look at a Rosenthal paper, because I think that he does, in at least one of his papers, say at the start, there are two problems. One is what are sensory qualities, and that's how these is the basis for how we classify experiences, sort them into types. And the other is consciousness proper, which seems to be more like awareness. For the purposes of understanding Fleming and Shea, I think that if my reading of Rosenthal is right, that there's a different explanation for sensory qualities than there is for what we'd call awareness, what Bloch would call access consciousness. Then I think Rosenthal can accommodate the whole structure view as well.
And I guess the more interesting question is there a version of higher order thought theory that is stable enough to do that? Even if it's not the view Rosenthal holds.
Yeah.
Is there a higher order thought theory that can take the instantiation view?
Yeah. The whole structure view.
So they're saying if you're a higher order thought theorist, you have to have the instantiation view.
Yeah, because they think that the higher order thought explains the sensory qualities as well. That's how I'm reading them anyway. I might be way off.
Doesn't it depend on the nature of the higher order thought? If the higher order thought can have some resemblance to the sensory space in virtue of it being about the first order thought, then can't there still be...
No, so their reasoning is that a higher order thought seems to me to be, based on what I quoted, that higher order thoughts can only represent the relations between mental qualities that are occurring concurrently and not across time.
Why? Why is a higher order thought theory constrained in that way? Because awareness is a current.
Yes, I think so. So the next thing they talk about is global workspace theory. And there are variants of global workspace theory which seem to me to have this same sort of structure. All of the quality space stuff, they might say, is about mental representation, and what a theory of consciousness has to do is not explain the relations between experiences, but tell us why we're aware of only some of what we represent. There are versions of a global workspace theory which are designed to distinguish between conscious and unconscious information processing, and to not explain the stuff that I said at the start a theory of consciousness should explain, which is quality spaces. I read Dennett like that. So variants of a global workspace theory seem to me to have same sort of structure as something like my reading of Rosenthal, that all the quality space stuff they could say is about mental representation, or more strictly the contents of mental representations, and what a theory of consciousness has to do is not explain the relationships between experiences, which is the premise that I started with, but tell us about why we're aware of only some of what we represent, of what our mental contents are. So they need to distinguish between conscious and unconscious information processing, which is not a term I like. But Fleming and Shea give us a way to put quality spaces into the global workspace in a different way, I think. So they give the example of binocular rivalry, which we talked about before. That's where you present one image to the left eye, a different image to the right eye, and people experience them as alternating rather than as in a superposition. So during this, they claim activity in the kinds of visual areas of the brain that a localist would care about stay pretty stable. But activity in the prefrontal cortex changes at stimulus onset. Now that is not, I'm not sure is entirely consistent with their reading of the monkey study that we were talking about before. But again, that might just be, I'm not smart enough to tell what the studies are from their paper. Here they're trying to motivate the idea that the relevant quality space is the one that's in the prefrontal cortex, and thus what's in the broadcast in the global workspace, rather than the one that's in the visual areas that the localist was caring about a bit earlier in their argument.
What was the very first part of that sentence? That the relevant
quality space for what the subject sees in a binocular rivalry experiment is in the prefrontal cortex rather than in the visual cortex.
So they would disagree with us that the content is explained by what's going on in the visual cortex? If they don't, then you're replicating it. They have to say that the content that enables us to make the judgments isn't in the visual cortex, but is instead in the higher one. Otherwise, so what?
Yeah, because then it's quite Cartesian theory, right? Because it's represented once in the visual cortex and then a second time in the broadcast.
Yeah.
How they put it, is that it's unclear whether and how the PFC instantiates a quality space as opposed to reading out task-dependent aspects of organised localist representations. So I think
task-dependent aspects of local. So does local mean back of the brain?
So I think here localist is tying to the localist view that they were talking about before, which is that quality spaces are in sensory systems. They say there is reason to favour the readout view because activity in the PFC and thus whatever is represented there seems to be quite task dependent.
And the readout view to explain awareness or phenomenal quality? Or both?
How I'm reading this, because they have it contrasted, is that there's one view on which the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, implements the quality space that we are conscious of. And then that's contrasted to the reading out view, which is working with the localist assumption that the quality space as such is back of the brain in the sensory systems, and the PFC is picking out the task-dependent things that someone needs from that representation.
And they are endorsing...
They're saying there's reason to favour the readout view, which is the second one.
What are the reasons?
That activity in the prefrontal cortex and thus whatever is represented there seems to be quite task-dependent. That is, much more of the prefrontal cortex is reactive to task-relevant stimulus features. So more of it responds to the colour of a stimulus if colour is what you're told matters for a sorting task. But that's not true of parts of the brain like the ventral visual pathways, which they talked about before, which will respond to colour the same amount regardless of whether or not that matters to the task that you're told to perform.
It's a pity they don't talk about where does it happen as opposed to what is the appropriate account. And I just died. Yep. Which shows how confused I am. Yeah. Because how is that not where does it happen as opposed to what's the appropriate account? Wouldn't they need to say not what's active but the resemblance?
Like they say as well, and all credit to them for saying this, if global functions like attention change quality spaces, and that's an empirical question, then the idea of the prefrontal cortex instantiating a quality space might be back on the table, if that's where the modified space is. So they're going to close out their argument by considering what they call leaner versions of the views that we just talked about. The full content view says that the quality space is carried by the higher order thought or the broadcast representation, for example, in prefrontal cortex activity. Leaner views seem to me to be more like how I read Rosenthal or the readout version of the global workspace. The quality space is identified with the lower order representation of the activity in the brain areas that the localist cares about, going back to that assumption. But I'm not clear on this because they introduce a variety of other views here. I'm not sure that the confusion is all mine. I mean, it probably is, but I'm not convinced it is, because here's a couple of quotes as to what they're saying in this section. So the first one, quote, a leaner version of higher order theory is provided by the higher order state space, which proposes that a higher order state tags first order perceptual content with a degree of reliability or experiential magnitude. Contents become conscious when the level of first order magnitude or precision crosses a certain threshold. Under this view, the contents of perception are determined by first order activations within sensory systems, similar to localist accounts, and no aspect needs to be re-represented to form part of conscious experience. End quote. Quote, lean workspace accounts also hold that while an additional process is needed to make sensory representations globally available, hence conscious, the first order contents need not be re-represented. One example is the global playground, a broad network of areas among which sensory representations are shared and maintained for several hundreds of milliseconds, thus offering wider cognitive possibilities compared with automatic unconscious processing, but with no specific agenda. The global playground does not require contents to be re-represented to become conscious. End quote. And it's the use of re-representation here which is throwing me.
Because that's straw man take on higher order thought accounts. Well, that's what Rosenthal spends a lot of papers trying to avoid.
Yeah. So it makes it sound like the less lean full content versions that we were talking about are Cartesian theatres, where something that is represented unconsciously has to be represented a second time in consciousness. And I'd always read higher order thought, and at least the more careful versions of global workspace, as explicitly not Cartesian theatres, precisely so they can deal with Dennett's interpretation of priming.
Look, I just think the idea that you need to re-represent it is... Everyone thinks that leads to an infinite regress.
Yes, yeah.
And so nobody says they hold that.
Mm.
And so to say that they in fact hold that, I feel like it's a straw man.
Yeah.
And you can say that they hold the straw man position, but that's something you need to
argue for. Yeah. And again, that's not going to turn up in a text paper if they think that...
But why does it matter?
Yeah.
What work is that straw man position doing?
The work that it seems to be doing... So I'm trying to understand the bulk of their argument here, and I think it is that they want us to lean towards a whole structure view where the phenomenal character of a single point in quality space is affected by the overall structure of the quality space. And they're looking at what assumptions about a theory of consciousness, like, so the localist versus not assumption, or a particular theories of consciousness like higher order thought, Rosenthal's version of higher order thought, and the global workspace view can accommodate that reading of quality spaces. And I think they might be trying to say that there's reason to doubt that you can get these into something like Rosenthal's version of a higher order thought theory of consciousness.
Why?
So there's two parts to that argument. The first is that higher order thoughts can't distinguish between experiences that occur at different times. That was that first quote. And that unless you take the higher order state space version, you end up with a re-representation in the higher order thought. I think those are the two key premises to that argument there as applied to Rosenthal.
Say the first premise again.
I first quoted this a while back in our conversation, so I'll read the two quotes again. According to Rosenthal's higher order theory, qualitative character is given by higher order thoughts that represent mental qualities in terms of locations in quality space.
Yeah, that's
the next
not his
bit.
position.
Yeah, that's the bit that I was disagreeing with.
Okay. Represent them in terms of their location.
Yeah.
So they don't instantiate the relations. They say that this is near that.
Yeah.
This is red is closer to orange than it is to blue.
Only if you're experiencing orange and blue at the same time as red. The subject can appreciate the relation between two mental qualities that occur concurrently and thus discriminate between them, but not between experiences that occur at different times. This is how they're reading Rosenthal, as far as I can tell. That last part was a quote. Instantiated relations contribute to phenomenal character, but the whole structure of quality space does not.
Independently of whether Rosenthal. I don't see how that can work.
Why would you?
Could be a stable position.
Why would you be attracted to that sort of view? I think would be if you don't think that similarity is the basis of phenomenal qualities, but you still need to acknowledge that we can make similarity judgments, and you need some explanation of how that occurs.
Yeah, there's something I am missing.
Yeah. I don't think that's entirely you, and it's quite possibly just me trying to explain my reading of their paper, but I don't think it's super clear on one, whether or not this is a criticism, and if it is a criticism of Rosenthal, whether it really works.
I think where I'm stuck is I just think that, in fact, the thermometer is just so not how it works. Yeah. That's meant to be the equivalent of surely.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
And surely, for those who are new to talking to us, is, well, surely it's like that.
It's not an argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm finding it really hard to take the thermometer view seriously, or to understand what it means. Because, in fact, we never instantiate an isolated phenomenal quality.
Yeah.
And when we do, its content changes.
Just, yeah.
So why should we be trying to say it's ever like the thermometer? I think it's just not how it works.
Yeah.
And so what they're trying to do is say there is a version of higher order thought theory that makes it like the thermometer, and therefore that's false. And I'm like, well, no thermometer view can work.
Yeah, but I'm not sure then if they are saying therefore it's false, or therefore it should be this other way. Therefore it should be...
But are they using that...
the full content thing. But then the full content thing sounds like a Cartesian theatre, or the way they phrase it all in terms of re-representation.
And are they saying the only way to have a higher order thought is a re-representation, and so you can't have higher order thought theory?
No, they're not saying that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they... Isn't it fun to watch somebody try and understand something they haven't read?
Yeah. All right. With that, we will sign off. I think we enjoyed that paper. I did. Thanks for listening to us be confused.
It's hard work.